everybody. Welcome to today's lecture. Today, as you can see, we're going to be talking about the civil rights movements. During the period of 1945 to 1975, there were actually many civil rights movements. The one that we're going to be focusing on here today is predominantly the civil rights of African Americans. But at the very end of this lecture, I'm going to have you watch a film which will talk about the rise of second wave feminism and essentially another women's right movement. But the civil rights movement, in some respects, historians have called this period the Second Reconstruction because the achievements of the post-Civil War period were really lost on African Americans for the 100 or so years after the Civil War ended. And we've talked a bit about Reconstruction, and we've talked a bit about race relations with respects to African Americans and Anglo Americans after the Civil War. And really the tensions have been pretty high between those two races. And by the 1960s, African Americans had pretty much had enough of waiting around. In fact, in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a book called Why We Can't Wait. Right? We are no longer waiting for our rights to be given to us, right? And the civil rights movement is an important and an interesting movement, but there is some new scholarship that has come out that helps us to recast the civil rights movement. The traditional story has the civil rights movement beginning in 1955 or so, 1954, when Rosa Parks spontaneously refused to give up her seat on the bus, which would spark the bus boycott, which would inaugurate the civil rights movement, right? Well, there's a new book that has come out written by Danielle McGuire called At the Dark End of the Street: Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, a new history of the civil rights movement from Rosa Parks to the rise of Black Power. And I want to cover a little bit of this with you as sort of an introduction to the civil rights movement, because one of the things I think McGuire does really well in this text is to help us to understand that what Rosa Parks did that day on the bus was not a spontaneous act. And for many African Americans, especially African American women, the civil rights movement had as much, and for McGuire, more to do with the protection of black womanhood. Okay, and the ending of white violence, specifically rape, upon black bodies, particularly female black bodies. Okay, and I'm going to be having you do more with this book this week. So, as we get into this, I want you to really rethink about how McGuire's book might recast the civil rights movement. Okay, I want to start, before we get into the lecture, to read a bit to you from her book, and her book is about rape and black women, and she talks about multiple counts of rape. It actually makes reading her book very difficult to do because you're constantly having to come to terms with the multiple instances of rape of white men upon black bodies, black female bodies, right? And the first instance of rape that she speaks about is a woman by the name of Ressie Taylor. And I want to read to you a portion of her book. She writes, "In later years, historians would paint Rosa Parks as a sweet and reticent old woman whose tired feet caused her to defy Jim Crow segregation on Montgomery's city buses. Her solitary and spontaneous act, the story has it, sparked the 1955 bus boycott and gave birth to the civil rights movement." This, according to McGuire, is the traditional story. She goes, but Rosa Parks was a militant race woman, a sharp detective, and an anti-rape activist long before she became the patron saint of the bus boycott. After meeting with Ressie Taylor, Rosa Parks helped form the Committee for Equal Justice. With support from local people, she helped organize what the Chicago Defender called, quote, "the strongest campaign for equal justice to be seen in a decade." 11 years later, this group of homegrown leaders would become known as the Montgomery Improvement Association. She says, the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, often heralded as the opening scene of the civil rights movement, was in many ways the last act of a decade-long struggle to protect black women, like Ressie Taylor, from sexualized violence and rape. In other words, one of the main arguments that McGuire is going to make here is that the civil rights movement was not necessarily rooted in an attempt to desegregate. This, of course, was one of the things that happened. But for Rosa Parks, it wasn't an issue of segregation. It was an issue of rape. It was an issue that had been boiling over in her for many years, long before the bus boycott happened. And McGuire actually argues, and there's some validity to this, but she argues that when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, she did not do this spontaneously, but rather this was a preconceived idea. This was something that had been planned, okay? And so she wants us to understand that segregation was not the catalyst. Rosa Parks and her spontaneous act is not as accurate of a depiction of the civil rights movement as it otherwise could be. Now, this week I'm actually having you watch a couple videos on this book. I'm having you read a summary of the central argument of this book and then respond to it, okay? Because I think this book is that important, if only to think through what the argument is. And let me conclude by reading this from her book. She writes, "The brutal rape of Ressie Taylor in 1944 and the sexual exploitation of thousands of other black women in the United States before and after the Civil War, this is a central part of our history that has been grossly understated and unacknowledged for far too long. Though it may seem unnecessary, even lurid, to examine the details of sexual violence, it is crucial that we hear the testimonies that black women offered at the time. Ressie Taylor's willingness, for example, to identify those who attacked her and to testify against them in 2 grand juries broke the institutional silence surrounding the long history of white men's violation of black women, countered efforts to shame or stereotype her as unchaste, and made white Southern leaders, including the governor of Alabama, recognize her personhood. As a result, her testimony, like so many others, was a momentous event that deserves our recognition. Until we come to terms with our history, even its most shameful secrets, we can neither really understand the past nor appreciate the present." And really what Danielle McGuire's book does is it helps us to re-understand and rethink through the civil rights movement, okay? And I want us to think through her book. And I don't intend to lecture on her work anymore here in this particular lecture, but we do have some things to think through with her work and with respects to her work this week, okay? So I've harped on that enough now. I want to dive into my lecture, okay? And so let's move forward and let's provide some context, and then we'll dive into how this civil rights movement unfolded. Okay, so let's move on. All right, it says, because large segments of the population, and we're talking about the American population, and this could be a whole host of various minority groups, right? But it says, because large segments of the American population, particularly African Americans, women, and historically too, men without property, because they have not always been accorded full citizenship rights in the American Republic, civil rights movements or freedom struggles have been a frequent feature of the nation's history. In other words, because the United States declared that all men were created equal and then treated many people as though they weren't, there has been a need multiple times for these freedom struggles, and the civil rights movement of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s is no exception. It says, in particular, movements to obtain civil rights for black Americans have had a special historical significance, right? And in part, and in large part, it's because that struggle for equality is rooted in a much larger narrative that has slavery at its root, okay? It says, these movements have not only secured citizenship rights for blacks, but have also redefined prevailing conceptions of the nature of civil rights and the role of government in protecting civil rights. In fact, what we saw after the Civil War was that the government failed to protect civil liberties for newly freed slaves, right? Once Reconstruction ended, Jim Crow became manifestly entrenched in the South, with the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which made things separate but equal, right? Of course, we know they were always separate but never equal, right? This made segregation legal, okay? And despite what we may proclaim in the Constitution, despite what was promised to African Americans after the Civil War, the truth of the matter is that they were continually treated as second-class citizens. They were treated in many ways as slaves without masters. They were afforded freedom, but they were not allowed to practice that freedom. And thus, we have these various freedom struggles. And again, I don't want to marginalize other minority groups, because indeed African Americans are not the only group of people who have struggled and had to fight for their civil liberties, right? Other groups have as well. But because of the unique historical position that African Americans have played in the United States, I feel it imperative to speak about them specifically more in depth. Okay. All right. With that said, let's move forward. Okay, to provide some additional context and historicize this a bit, one of the things we want to make sure that we understand is what some of the rights are that African Americans achieved in the post-Civil War period. It says the most important achievements of African American civil rights movements have been the post-Civil War constitutional amendments. And there are 3 constitutional amendments that specifically deal with African Americans and deal with the issue of slavery and civil liberties, right? And they are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? Here we see the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution officially abolished and prohibited slavery and indentured servitude, right? So there can be no slavery in the United States. There can be no form of indentured servitude in the United States, thanks to the 13th Amendment. And the reality is of these 3 amendments, that particular one has been upheld. Never again has there been slavery in the United States. Now, this does not mean that people weren't treated like slaves. This doesn't mean that people were treated all equally. Indeed, they weren't. But the 13th Amendment did abrogate slavery, and never again has there been a legal institution of slavery. Okay, the 14th Amendment to the United States, perhaps, and some could easily argue, the most important amendment in the Constitution, but the 14th Amendment to the United States declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are American citizens, and this included African Americans. Okay, and so basically what the 14th Amendment did was it applied the rights of citizenship to African Americans. Now, the 14th Amendment has been violated more times than any other amendment in the Constitution. And for African Americans, they were denied their 14th Amendment rights frequently, immediately following the Civil War and during the Civil Rights Movement, as we will see. And then finally, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibited each government in the United States from denying a citizen the right to vote based upon that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Ladies, the 15th Amendment did not grant the right to vote to people based upon gender. It would take, as we saw, an additional amendment, the 19th Amendment in 1920, to bring about equality for women with the right to vote. Okay, but these particular amendments to the Constitution were to guarantee to African Americans the right of citizenship, right? Unfortunately, as we saw and have seen, those rights were habitually and frequently denied, and denied on a legal way as well, because, again, as we mentioned, numerous court cases allowed for segregation, allowed for racialized discrimination to continue and to become entrenched, predominantly in the American South, but throughout the whole United States as well. Okay? All right, let's move on. It goes on to state here that nearly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, and the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863, and ultimately the Emancipation Proclamation actually didn't free any slaves, and it in fact did not apply to slaves that were held in Union territories. It applied only to slaves in the Confederacy. But nonetheless, whether or not the Emancipation Proclamation freed anybody, one of the things that we can say is that it definitely put the United States on a trajectory to abolishing slavery. So 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans in southern states still inhabited a starkly unequal world of disenfranchisement, which means they couldn't vote even though the Constitution said they could. They were segregated thanks to Plessy v. Ferguson, and here at the bottom, if you click on Plessy v. Ferguson when this slide is done, you can watch a very short documentary which covers what Plessy v. Ferguson was, but essentially Plessy v. Ferguson allowed for racialized segregation, okay, including race-inspired violence. It says Jim Crow laws at the local and state levels barred them from classrooms and bathrooms, from theaters and train cars, and from juries and legislatures. The reality is that despite the achievements of the post-Civil War amendments, African Americans were still treated as second-class citizens. Okay, and I want to read to you a portion of Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, Why We Can't Wait. He wrote this in 1963. I believe it came out after he was arrested in Birmingham, but I could be wrong. But this is what he writes, and I want you to hear what King has to say, because he's speaking and he's attesting to this 100 years of inequality. All right? He says this. He says, "It is the beginning of the year of our Lord, 1963. He says, I see a young Negro boy. He is sitting on a stoop in front of a vermin-infested apartment house in Harlem. The stench of garbage is in the halls. The drunks, the jobless, the junkies are shadow figures of his everyday world. The boy goes to a school attended mostly by Negro students with a scattering of Puerto Ricans. His father is one of the jobless. His mother is a sleep-in domestic working for a family on Long Island. I see a young Negro girl. She is sitting on the stoop of a rickety wooden one-family house in Birmingham. Some visitors would call it a shack. It needs paint badly, and the patched-up roof appears in danger of caving in. Half a dozen small children in various stages of undress are scampering about the house. The girl is forced to play the role of their mother. She can no longer attend the all-Negro school in her neighborhood because her mother died only recently after a car accident. Neighbors say if the ambulance hadn't come so late to take her to the all-Negro hospital, the mother would still be alive. The girl's father is a porter in a downtown department store. He will always be a porter, for there are no promotions for the Negro in this store, where every counter serves him except the one that sells hot dogs and orange juice. This boy and this girl, separated by stretching miles, are wondering, why does misery constantly haunt the Negro? In some distant past, had their forebears done some tragic injury to the nation, and was the curse of punishment upon the black race? Had they shirked in their duty as patriots, betrayed their country, denied their national birthright? Had they refused to defend their land against a foreign foe? And he goes on and he writes quite a bit, but he says here towards the end of his introduction, he writes, the boy and the girl knew more than history. They knew something about current events. They knew that African nations had burst the bonds of colonialism. They knew that a great-great-grandson of Crispus Attucks might be ruled out of some restricted all-white restaurant in some restricted all-white section of a southern town, his United States Marine uniform notwithstanding. They knew that Negroes living in the capital of their own nation were confined to ghettos and could not always get a job for which they were qualified. They knew that white supremacists had defied the Supreme Court and that Southern governors had attempted to interpose themselves between the people and the highest law of the land. They knew that for years their own lawyers had won great victories in the courts which were not being translated into reality. They were seen on TV, hearing from the radio, reading in the newspaper that this was the 100th birthday of their freedom. But freedom had a dull ring, a mocking emptiness when, in their time, in the short lifespan of this boy and girl, buses had stopped rolling in Montgomery, sit-inners were jailed and beaten, freedom riders were brutalized and mobbed, dogs' fangs were barred in Birmingham and in Brooklyn. New York, there were certain kinds of construction jobs for white-onlys. It was the summer of 1963. Was emancipation a fact? Was freedom a force? The boy in Harlem stood up. The girl in Birmingham arose. Separated by stretching miles, both of them squared their shoulders and lifted their eyes toward heaven. Across the miles they joined hands and took a firm forward step. It was a step that rocked the richest, most powerful nation to its foundation. This is the story of that boy and that girl. This is the story of why we can't wait. A very powerful indictment of America, if ever you have read one. Martin Luther King Jr. writes very poetically that the promise of freedom has failed the African American, and it is time to rise up and fight for that freedom. Now, when did that fight begin? Did it begin, as the traditional narrative has it, with Rosa Parks giving up her seat? Of course not. The fight had been going on long before that. But with respects to a civil rights movement, I think it's important to first and foremost remember Danielle McGuire. But her notwithstanding, I think it's important to recognize the civil rights movement in many ways began in the 1940s. There were some political and cultural changes and shifts that occurred in the 1940s, which I think lead to the movement which develops more fully in the 1950s and matures in the 1960s. Recall that during World War II, there is the double V among African Americans, the double victory over fascism, victory over racism at home. Well, fascists were defeated, but racism was not at home, and the civil rights movement is going to fight for just that. So, with that all said, let's now dive into where this story begins. It says the civil rights movement is oftentimes seen as beginning in 1954. But to begin there, or to do so, would be to overlook the accomplishments of Harry Truman in the 1940s, accomplishments which started the move towards the civil rights movement. Okay, we have to properly contextualize this movement. All right, it didn't just begin from nothing. Okay, it says in the book America: A Narrative History, it says, for most of his political career, Harry Truman had shown little concern for the plight of African Americans. He had grown up in western Missouri, assuming that blacks and whites preferred to be segregated from one another. As president, however, he began to reassess his convictions. In the fall of 1946, Truman hosted a delegation of civil rights activists who urged him to issue a public statement condemning the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and the lynching of African Americans. The delegation graphically described incidents of torture and intimidation against blacks that was occurring in the South. Truman was appalled by what he had heard. He soon appointed a committee on civil rights to investigate violence against African Americans and to recommend preventative measures. In its recommendations, the committee urged the renewal of the Fair Employment Practices Committee and the creation of a permanent civil rights commission to investigate abuses. It also argued that federal aid be denied to any state that mandated segregated schools and public facilities. In other words, what Truman's efforts are going to do is it's going to bring about changes, right? There is now this focus on civil liberties, okay? And one of the things that occurs, as we read and we'll see again here, is the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which basically said that you cannot deny people of African American race or ethnicity the right to work in the government based upon their ethnicity, right? You have to have fair practices, okay? It says, thus, on February 2nd, 1948, President Harry Truman sent a special message to Congress on civil rights, announcing that he had, quote, instructed the Secretary of Defense to take steps to have the remaining instances of discrimination in the armed services eliminated as rapidly as possible, okay? So in addition to making sure that there are fair hiring practices, Truman also desegregates the military. Okay? He also ensures that the military will now engage in fair practices as well, and that segregation and discrimination will not be found, right? Now, you know, we commend his efforts, but one of the things we must keep in mind is that no matter what changes occur, no matter what presidents do or don't do for civil liberties, you cannot legislate the hearts of mankind. There are no laws that one can pass to make people who hate another people like them, right? Much as we saw with prohibition, you can pass a law that says you can't drink, but people still drink, right? You can pass a law that says you can't segregate, but that doesn't mean people quickly desegregated, right? You know, and the thing of it is that with Harry Truman and his desegregation of the military, this comes in 1948, but the military isn't fully integrated until the Vietnam War, which, as we saw, ends in 1975. So this takes some time. But again, it's important for us to recognize the achievements in the beginning of this civil rights movement. Not necessarily with Rosa Parks, albeit she's an incredibly important figure to the civil rights movement, but to fail to look at this early achievement, I think is troubling and problematic. But I've digressed a bit here, so let's get back and let's move on to the next slide. It says that on July 26, Truman followed this up by signing Executive Order 9981, establishing the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services. It says it was coupled with Executive Order 9980, creating a Fair Employment Board, which we've already mentioned, charged with eliminating racial bias in federal employment, right? No longer can you only hire whites, right? You have to have fair hiring practices, okay? It says it took the military more years to comply with Truman's orders, however. It says in the 1950s, few blacks served as officers, particularly in the Navy. Still, the number of frontline black troops rose in the Korean War compared to the World War II, when, with few exceptions, blacks were relegated to performing menial tasks. Okay, so by Korean War, and then definitely by the end of the Vietnam War, you do see desegregated units. Blacks and whites are going to fight together, and you do see that African Americans are given positions that hold more significance and more weight than just menial tasks, right? They are permitted to become officers and what have you. And so, again, Truman's presidency, there's a lot that went on during it, but one of the things that does happen during his presidency is he sort of inaugurates the civil rights movement, and he does so by, one, desegregating the military and ensuring that there's equality there, and he also does it by ensuring that there is equality and fair hiring practices for government jobs. Okay, so politically, militaristically, right, there's some changes going on with respects to civil liberties, but they are not the only important changes to occur in the 1940s. During the 1940s, the civil rights movement manifested itself in some important popular cultural trends as well, and specifically, I'm speaking about sports. Let's move on. Okay. And when we're talking about sports, and I'm moving here down to the bottom, we think about Jackie Robinson, right? This is the individual who defied tradition, right? This is the man who was the first African American to play baseball, right? An incredibly significant individual. It says, meanwhile, and I'm reading out of America Narrative History, it says, meanwhile, racial segregation was being confronted in a much more public field of endeavor, professional baseball. In April 1947, as the baseball season opened, the National League's Brooklyn Dodgers included on its roster the first African-American player to cross the color line in Major League Baseball. This, of course, was Jackie Robinson. Okay, Jackie Robinson was an incredibly talented individual, but he was heckled quite a bit. In fact, there was a lot of things thrown at him by players, not by players, but by audience members who watched the games. He was heckled by them. There were frequent times when the hotels, when the team would go off to play, that they wouldn't house him because he was African American. But Jackie Robinson rose above it all, and he never responded to it. He never responded heckling with heckling, right? He went above that. Okay. It says, during his first season with the Dodgers, teammates and opposing players viciously baited Robinson. Pitchers threw at him, base runners spiked him, and spectators booed him in every city. Hotels refused him rooms, and restaurants denied him service. Hate mail arrived by the bucket load. On the other hand, black spectators were electrified by Robinson's courageous example, and they turned out in droves to watch him play. But what Jackie Robinson does is he breaks that color line. Okay? He demonstrates that African Americans can and will integrate into professional sports, and they are talented, right? Jackie Robinson was one of the most talented, if not the most talented player in the Brooklyn Dodgers lineup that year and subsequent years, okay? And so when we think about the civil rights movement, again, we have to contextualize it. It doesn't start just with Rosa Parks, right? If you're Danielle McGuire, it starts with racialized violence and rape against black bodies, right? And that's an important narrative to understand. If we don't understand that, we can at least begin to recognize that, the accomplishments of Harry Truman and others like Jackie Robinson, they sort of began to lay a cornerstone for the much larger civil rights movement, and then later the Black Power movement, which developed in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s as well. Okay, so I say all this just simply to provide some context to understand how this civil rights movement began, because it doesn't begin in a vacuum. All right. Okay, before you move on to the next slide, go ahead and click on the word Jackie Robinson there. It's going to provide you, I think it's like a 3-minute video on Jackie Robinson. It's going to talk a little bit about what he did after baseball, because he continued to go on to fight for civil liberties once his career had ended. So go ahead and click on that, and then move on to the next slide. Okay, now we've been speaking about desegregation, and we've been talking a bit about Truman's desegregation of the military, sort of desegregation with respects to fair hiring practices, and of course desegregation or integration in popular professional sports. But arguably, and I would argue, in fact, the most significant event to occur in the civil rights movement for desegregation, right, was the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Now, the Brown versus Board of Education decision effectively repeals Plessy v. Ferguson, and it basically says that you cannot segregate people in public schools. Now, what Brown v. Board of Education does not do is it does not desegregate the buses. It does not desegregate restaurants, right? It's going to take other desegregation movements, as we will talk about, including the bus boycott, to get other public arenas desegregated. But what Brown v. Board of Education does is it really sets up the main thrust for those other segregation movements, right, or desegregation movements. Now, the Brown v. Board of Education decision, it too did not just come out of a vacuum. There were other cases that had been heard with respects to segregation and desegregation prior to it, and so it had a history already behind it. But this Brown v. Board of Education decision was a watershed moment in American history, because for the first time the government is going to say and move towards a state of equality for African Americans, that they recognized that calling something separate but equal, even if there were equal accommodations, which there weren't, but even if there were, this still has a psychological stigma. Okay, so it says perhaps the greatest move towards desegregation occurred in 1954 through the Brown v. Board of Education decision. It says Linda Brown was denied admission to her local elementary school in Topeka because she was black. When combined with several other cases, her suit reached the Supreme Court. That body, in an opinion by recently appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren, broke with long tradition and unanimously overruled the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy v. Ferguson, holding for the first time that de jure segregation in the public schools violated the principle of equal protection under the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. In other words, Brown v. Board of Education said, you know what, we were wrong in Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson and de jure segregation does violate the 14th Amendment, and thus schools, public schools throughout all of the United States, must desegregate. Now, the wording of the Brown v. Board of Education was problematic, because what the Board of Education decision said was that schools needed to desegregate, quote, with all deliberate speed. And that could mean different things to different people. And the truth of the matter is that when you told the South that they had to desegregate, they were simply going to ignore that and dig their heels into the ground and keep segregation entrenched. In fact, Eisenhower, who was president during the Brown v. Board of Education decision, said that he didn't like the decision, and he doesn't like it because he's in favor of segregation. He doesn't like it because he thought that the decision would set the country back, that you're trying to force people to do something they don't want to do. Okay? All right, let's move forward. Continuing on with Brown v. Board of Education, it says, responding to legal and sociological arguments presented by the NAACP lawyers led by Thurgood Marshall, the court stressed that the badge of inferiority stamped on minority children by segregation hindered their full development, no matter how quote-unquote equal the physical facilities might be. Right? In other words, you could put black and whites and other groups of people in separate facilities and have them all equal. But when you segregate them, despite the equality of the facility, there is this stamp of inferiority that gets placed upon those children who are being segregated. And this results in a sociological and psychological problem. Okay? It says, after hearing further arguments on the implementation, the court declared in 1955 that schools must be desegregated again with all deliberate speed. And it's problematic to say that, because with all deliberate speed means different things to different people. All right? Reading from my book, American Narrative History, it says, Eisenhower refused to force states to comply with the court's decisions. In fact, he said he would not enforce Brown v. Board of Education, right? one of the things that we have to remember is that courts can make the decisions they want, but they can't enforce their own laws, right? It takes the president to do that. And Eisenhower says, I am not going to enforce Brown v. Board of Education. Okay, back to the book. It says, privately he maintained that the Supreme Court decision set back progress in the South at least 15 years. The fellow who tries to tell me you can do these things by force is just plain nuts, right? Now, Eisenhower originally said he would not enforce Brown v. Board of Education. As we will see, he is going to have to renege on this, and he is in fact going to have to enforce Brown v. Board of Education, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But initially he says, I'm not going to enforce it because I don't want to force people to do something that they don't really want to do. And again, we should not take from this that Eisenhower is a flaming racist. By no means is that true. He just doesn't think that forcing people to do something is the way to get things accomplished, right? It goes on to state that while token integration began as early as 1954 in the border states of Kentucky and Missouri, hostility began to mount in the Deep South and in Virginia, led by the newly formed Citizens Council. The Citizens Council, as you may or may not be aware of, the Citizens Council is comparable to the Ku Klux Klan, except the Citizens Council doesn't use violence as a way to get people to comply, right? The Ku Klux Klan used violence as a way to keep African Americans originally from voting, right? You use torture, you use terror to frighten African Americans to comply with white demands, right? The demands made by whites, right? The Citizens Council, they emerge immediately following this this decision. In fact, they'd been around before then, but they begin to move in force after the Brown v. Board of Education decision to do the same thing that the Ku Klux Klan would have done. It says the Citizens Councils were were middle and upper class versions of the Ku Klux Klan that spread quickly across the region and eventually controlled 250,000 members. Instead of physical violence, the Citizens Council used economic coercion against blacks who crossed racial boundaries. African Americans who defied white supremacy would lose their jobs, have their insurance policies canceled, or be denied personal loans or home mortgages. The Citizens Councils grew so powerful in many communities that membership became almost a prerequisite for an aspiring white politician. Okay? And the reality is that when we look at what the Citizens Council is doing, they are doing exactly what Eisenhower was afraid of, that when you force people to comply with Brown v. Board of Education, their response is not going to be one of complicity. It's going to be one of forcing and fighting against it. Okay? It says thus, even after the Supreme Court declared that public school segregation was unconstitutional, black activism was still necessary to compel the federal government to implement the decision. Why? Because the Southerners, predominantly Southerners, were not going to comply with it. And so it's going to take a civil rights movement in order to get the law to be upheld, right? I mean, let's go back to the very first lecture we had on the New South when we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, right? And their disagreements over what African Americans should be doing in the post-Civil War period, right? Du Bois says ceaseless agitation, fight for your rights and take them now. Booker T. Washington says no, just bide your time, prove yourself useful, and eventually your rights will be given to you, right? Well, African Americans in many respects went ahead and followed Booker T. Washington's advice, and then 100 years later, they're still waiting for the Constitution to be enforced. The same thing could have happened here. If black activism had not flourished in the wake of Brown v. Board of Education, it is likely that that law too would not have been enforced. It was going to take a movement of cataclysmic proportion to get these laws forwarded, okay, and enforced, okay? And Brown v. Board of Education is one of those laws, and an example of that, okay? All right, let's keep going. All right, what is an example of African American activism to get segregation ended? Well, we finally arrive at Miss Rosa Parks, December 1st, 1955, right? Rosa Parks is on the bus. The traditional story has it that she's fatigued, she's tired after a long day of work. She's told to get in the back of the bus so that a white person can sit at the front, and she simply says, no, I'm tired, I'm not moving, and this starts the great civil rights movement. Hopefully by this point I have shown and proved that that is not in fact the case. What Rosa Parks does here is she is militantly refusing to give up her seat, and it is not a spontaneous act. It is rooted in a decade-long movement to help black women protect themselves from white violence, right? But what we see in Rosa Parks is her own action to try and get segregation dealt with. Why? Because the government isn't enforcing segregation or desegregation, right? And so it's going to take black activism to get that to happen. And Rosa Parks, in fact, is an example of that. So it says, for example, an example of this black activism is on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks of Montgomery, Alabama, refuses to give up her seat to a white bus rider, thereby defying a Southern custom that required blacks to give seats toward the front of the buses to the whites. It says, when she was jailed, a black community boycott of the city's buses began, right? Now, one of the things that is true in the traditional narrative of the civil rights movement history is that Rosa Parks' action does inaugurate the bus boycott. It inaugurates what becomes known as the Montgomery bus boycott. And the Montgomery bus boycott lasted a long time. And basically what this was it was African Americans boycotted using the buses. Now, this is an important thing because African Americans were the predominant patrons of the buses. And when all African Americans stopped using buses, it hit buses in their organizations in the pocketbook. And so over a period of time, after African Americans had mobilized, in fact, they bring in Martin Luther King Jr. as sort of the vocal spokesperson for the movement. And after a period of time, the buses eventually say, look, we are losing money. We're going to go ahead and desegregate. But we have to recognize that the buses and the southern communities or white communities rather, would not have desegregated on their own. It was going to take the efforts of African Americans to make that happen. Okay? It says the boycott lasted more than a year, demonstrating the unity and determination of black residents and inspiring blacks everywhere. Okay? It goes on here to say in my book, America Narrative History, quote, the Montgomery bus boycott achieved a remarkable solidarity. For 381 days, African Americans used carpools, hitchhiked, or simply walked. But the white civic leaders held out against the boycott and against the pleas of a bus company tired of losing money. The boycotters finally won a federal case they had initiated against bus segregation, and in 1956, the Supreme Court affirmed that the separate but equal doctrine can no longer be safely followed as a correct statement of the law. In other words, Brown v. Board of Education said you can't have segregation in the schools. The Montgomery bus boycott said the whole idea of separate but equal is no longer a correct statement of the law. And what the Montgomery bus boycott did was it said segregation is now going to be attacked in every arena of society, right? And it's going to lead to a number of different types of protests. There will be, as we will talk a little bit later, sit-ins, where people will simply go into areas where they were refused service and they will sit there and wait to be served. You will have freedom riders who will ride buses from city to city, proclaiming equality and freedom for all, right? These are peaceful types of protests, and those peaceful types of protests go hand in hand with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideology of civil disobedience, and we'll talk more about that. But again, what we see here is a need for black activism, because the law alone is not enough to get compliance. Okay? All right, let's move on. Here, of course, is Rosa Parks. This is when she was arrested. Just thought I'd give you the photo of her. Obviously, there's not a whole lot I got to say there, although I would take a look at her face. This is not a woman who appears to be frightened. But we must also remember, and I think it's important to remember, that Rosa Parks had been a militant advocate for African-American women against rape. Let us not forget that when she refuses to give up her seat on the bus, she has to be thinking in her own mind that she could easily be arrested, put into a squad car, taken out to the woods, raped and beaten and left for dead. And this happened all the time to black women, and it was something that she was keenly aware of and had been dealing with for over a decade. So she is a very courageous woman, not only because she's defying segregation, but she could very likely be giving herself over to be raped, right? And that's a very important reality and thing to remember, okay? And here she is. She looks quite resolute. She doesn't look afraid. She looks very pissed off, very determined, right? But in many ways, Rosa Parks is the ideal spokesperson for the civil rights movement at that time. Unfortunately, and Danielle McGuire makes this quite clear in her book, that once the Montgomery bus boycott began, the leaders of the civil rights movement, who were women, found themselves sort of marginalized, and men sort of took the center stage, even though, as she argues, it was mainly women who had been doing the work before this time. And that's a discourse that we can have later, and McGuire has in her book. It's not one I want to necessarily get into here, but it's something to think about. Okay, all right. I digress a bit. Let's get back into the lecture. All right, it says Martin Luther King Jr., who emerged as the boycott movement's most effective male leader, at least initially, he possessed unique conciliatory and oratorical skills. And in fact, we have already read some of those things in his book, Why We Can't Wait. It says he understood the larger significance of the boycott and quickly realized that the non-violent tactics used by the Indian nationalist Mahatma Gandhi could be used by Southern blacks. He writes, quote, I had come to see early that the Christian doctrine of love, operating through the Gandhian method of non-violence, was one of the most potent weapons available to the Negro in his struggle for freedom, Martin Luther King Jr. explained. Okay? In other words, instead of returning violence for violence, what we will do is we will be militantly non-violent. And this militant non-violence, again, manifests itself in sit-ins, wade-ins, which would have been African Americans swimming in pools that were segregated, right? It demonstrates itself through freedom riders. And I'm going to be showing you a film later on. It's probably one of the most important films that I have in this particular lecture, but you're going to see African Americans have attack dogs sicked on them. You're going to see them have water hoses shot, high-pressured water fire hoses shot on their backs, beaten. And all while this is going on, they do nothing. They just simply take it. Right? And what that does is it helps you to gain sympathy because you are being unjustly abused. And Martin Luther King Jr. says, let's be nonviolent. Now, not all African American leaders prescribed to this particular mode of resistance, including Malcolm X, whom we will hear from later, as well as the Black Panthers, who develop a little bit later. Okay? And these individuals don't necessarily think that Martin Luther King Jr. is making any significant strides. He says that he's not making significant strides to fix what's plaguing the black community. And you'll hear from Malcolm X a little bit later in this lecture. But it's important to note that what Martin Luther King Jr. does originally and initially is to forward a non-violent form of protest. And we're going to take a little bit of time to look at the way that manifested itself. Okay? Let's move on. All right, before I get into looking at the way that King's nonviolence worked and manifested, I want to digress a bit and take a look at a very important event. I mentioned earlier that Eisenhower said he would never enforce Brown v. Board of Education because he did not want to force people to do that which they don't want to do, because that would just create animosity. He's going to have to renege on this. And in 1957, there will be 9 children, African-American children, who are trying to go to high school. And they will be refused entry into the high school. And as a result, Eisenhower is going to have to send in guardsmen to protect what became known as the Little Rock Nine in order to go to high school. Okay? So a quick digression to sort of look at this important event. It says, while Parks and King had successfully desegregated buses, public schools in the South were less than compliant with the Brown decision. And in 1957, Eisenhower was forced to use force and uphold desegregation. Okay? It says 3 years after the Supreme Court's decision, which officially ended public school segregation, a federal court ordered Little Rock to comply with the desegregation order because they had not done so. It says on September 4th, 1957, Governor Orville Faubus defied the Supreme Court's decision, and he called in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent 9 African American students, who have now been dubbed the Little Rock Nine, from entering the school. They showed up, and the National Guard were there with guns. They allowed white students to enter into the school, but they would not allow African Americans to enter the school. They were barred from entering. Now, eventually, Faubus removes the National Guard. And when the students show back up, what they get to now deal with is a white mob who refuses to let them in. It is because of these actions that Eisenhower is going to be forced to have to send in aid to help the Little Rock Nine get into the school. Okay, moving on. It says 10 days later, in a meeting with President Eisenhower, Faubus agreed to use the National Guard to protect the African American teenagers, but on returning to Little Rock, he dismissed the troops, leaving the African American students exposed to an angry white mob. Within hours, the jeering, brick-throwing mob had beaten several reporters and smashed many of the school's windows and doors. By noon, local police were forced to evacuate the 9 students. Now, it's important to note that if Eisenhower did not respond by sending out paratroopers, the 101st Airborne Division gets sent out, we would have to vilify Eisenhower, because he would have said, I'm not going to protect these individuals. Luckily for him, and I think, rightly so, he reneges on his promise not to enforce desegregation. Okay? It says, when Faubus did not restore order, President Eisenhower dispatched the 101st Airborne Division paratroopers to Little Rock and put the Arkansas National Guard under federal command. It says, by 3 a.m., soldiers surrounded the school with bayonets fixed. And the 101st Airborne Division will allow for these African Americans to enter into Central High. Okay? And for the first couple weeks, they actually stood outside the classrooms and chaperoned these students from class to class, and so they felt very safe. Ultimately, this was a victory for desegregation, but it also demonstrated what Eisenhower had said, was that when you force someone to do something they don't want to do, they're going to resist you that much more. Okay? All right, moving on. It says, under federal protection, the Little Rock Nine finished out the school year. It says the following year, Faubus closed all the high schools, forcing the African American students to take correspondence courses or go to out-of-state schools. It says the school board reopened the schools in the fall of 1959, and despite more violence, for example, the bombing of one student's house, 4 of the 9 students returned. This time they were protected by local police, and one of those individuals was a man by the name of Ernest Green. And what I want you to do is just go ahead and click on that name, Ernest Green, and you're going to get to hear him speak about his experiences going to Central High and being part of the Little Rock Nine. And he will tell you he didn't think he was making history. He just wanted to go to school to open up opportunities for himself. But I think it's important to hear from those who experienced these things firsthand. And so go ahead and click on that, listen to what Ernest Green has to say, and then let's move on to the next section, where we'll begin to look more at the way that Martin Luther King Jr. implemented his nonviolent forms of protest. Okay? All right, go ahead and click on that. All right, it says, while Martin Luther King Jr. remained the major spokesperson for black aspirations, by 1960, a number of other people had adopted his nonviolent protest philosophy, and we're going to see this philosophy implemented on February 1st, 1960, when 4 freshmen at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College began what becomes a series of sit-ins, which was designed to end segregation at Southern lunch counters. Okay, it says these 4 students politely asked for service. Their request was refused. When asked to leave, they remained in their seats, hence the term sit-in. It says their passive resistance and peaceful sit-down demand helped ignite a youth-led movement to challenge racial inequality throughout the South. Now, one of the things I want to make reference here, and I don't want to say this tongue-in-cheek, what I want to say is that desegregation was a good thing. But one of the things I agree with Malcolm X with his criticism of Martin Luther King Jr. is you can gain desegregation, but that's not going to necessarily change the way people think and view African Americans. It's not going to change all of the structural things that are in place to keep African Americans in a status of second citizenship. And so I say that to digress a bit, but something to think about Yes, desegregation is good. Yes, Martin Luther King Jr. is a very important individual, and I agree that his nonviolent forms of protest, including these sit-ins, made some significant strides, and they are important. But at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, did these types of movements really address the central issue that was behind the segregation, right? You've corrected the segregation, but have we corrected that which caused the segregation to start with? And I think that's probably, as we come to hear Malcolm X, what he is concerned with. Okay, so I digress a bit, but I just wanted to say that to get us thinking a little bit. All right. Okay, let's move on. It says, in Greensboro, hundreds of students, civil rights organizations, churches, and members of the community joined in a 6-month-long protest. And I'm going to be showing you the 4 individuals who originally sat down at the Woolworth lunch counter to be served. They were denied service, and they start the sit-in movement. It says, according to one historian, quote, within a week, the sit-in movement had spread to 6 more towns in the state, and within 2 months, demonstrations had occurred in 54 cities and in 9 states. And so while Martin Luther King Jr. is the spokesperson for militant nonviolence, right, sit-ins, those types of things, many African Americans adopt this policy. They adopt this methodology, and they are going to begin sit-ins. And sit-ins occur not just in restaurants. It will happen in a lot of different places, but it just so happened that it began in a restaurant. Let me show you the picture of the first 4 gentlemen who started this movement. Here you have it. From left to right, these are the 4 protesters. It says 4 of the protesters, students at North Carolina A&T College, were from left to right. Starting from the left, you have Joseph McNeil in the glasses, sort of staring at you. There is Franklin McCain. Next to him is Billy Smith, and finally Clarence Henderson. Okay, these are the 4 men who began this process. Okay, and they were practicing King's philosophy of militant nonviolence. We will be militantly nonviolent, kind of oxymoronic, but nonetheless, it's important to recognize the methods that were used by these individuals, and sit-ins is one of those methods. Okay, all right, let's go forward. It says these protests spread rapidly throughout the South and led to the founding in April 1960 of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also referred to as the SNCC. It says this student-led group, even more aggressive in its use of nonviolent direct action tactics than King's SCLC, and the SCLC stands for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So you've got 2 organizations, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Both of these organizations are nonviolent organizations that are seeking to get segregation ended, right? But it says the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was even more aggressive in its use of nonviolence, and it stressed the development of autonomous local movements in contrast to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's strategy of using local campaigns to achieve national civil rights reforms. In other words, what the SNCC is trying to do is more of a grassroots movement, right? If we can get various local communities to rise up in nonviolent protest, then we can make some major achievements. And the SCLC, I don't think, would disagree with that, but they were going to try to take more of a national approach, right? They're going to establish campaigns to try to get federal legislation put into place to help protect civil liberties. Okay, so different approaches, but both of which are utilizing and implementing militant nonviolence. Okay, moving on. It says the SCLC, again the Southern Christian Leadership Conference protest strategy, achieved its first major success in 1963 when the group launched a major campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. It says highly publicized confrontations between nonviolent protesters, including school children on the one hand, and police with clubs, fire hoses, and police dogs on the other, gained Northern sympathy. Now, what I actually want you to do is I'm going to actually have you start this slide over. What I want you to do right now is to go to the next slide. If you click on the link on the next slide, there is a video there that I want you to watch, which will show you what was going on in 1963 in Birmingham. Okay, you're going to see African Americans shot with fire hoses. You're going to see Bull Connor, who is a flaming racist, bring out attack dogs to attack African American protesters. And the reason why this film is so important is because there were many people throughout the United States who frankly had no idea how bad the situation was in the South until this particular protest was televised, and people around the world could now see how horrific conditions were in the South. So again, go to that next slide, take a look at that film, and then come back, start this slide over, and then move down to this next content that is in blue. Okay? Alright, I'm going to assume that you have watched that film, and I'm sorry that you had to listen to the first part of that lecture again, but hopefully that film demonstrated to you just how brutal and difficult life was for African Americans in Birmingham, right? The letter from a Birmingham jail that Martin Luther King Jr. writes is powerful, and much of what he says is echoed in his book, Why We Can't Wait. Okay? But what that time does in Birmingham, again, as even the film said, is it exposes to the rest of the United States just how difficult and terrible things were. Okay? Alright. It says the Birmingham clashes and other simultaneous civil rights efforts prompted President Kennedy to push for passage of a new civil rights legislation, which in fact will be passed, not by him, but by his successor, Lyndon Johnson. It says, by the summer of 1963, the Birmingham protests had become only one of many local protest insurgencies that culminated in the August 28th March on Washington, which attracted at least 200,000 participants. Now, the March on Washington is the protest movement when Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you have to watch this, but if you've never heard that entire speech, it is a powerful speech. It's about 17 minutes long, and I have it linked here. If you click on March on Washington, you can listen to this speech. It is powerful, it is moving, and I would encourage you to listen to it, to watch it, to hear what he has to say, and think about what it is that he's getting at. Okay? So go ahead and click on that, and then move on to the next slide that has words or text. Okay? Okay, guys, this is the film I was talking about. Go ahead and click on that, watch it, and then go back to the previous slide and finish out the information there. So watch that. Again, it's somewhat difficult to watch because it is depicting some horrific racially motivated events, okay? But I think it's important to address these things. So go ahead and watch that. Okay. After this whole situation with Birmingham, and there were some other situations in Atlantic City, for example, where, you know, it's very clear that African Americans are being militantly abused. After these events have been publicized, there develops among some people within the SNCC a discontent with the philosophy of nonviolence, and it's understandable, right? What they are seeing, what they are experiencing is mass violence against them, and according to King, they're just supposed to sit and take it. It says, after the Atlantic City experience, disillusioned SNCC organizers worked with local leaders in Alabama to create the Loudness County Freedom Organization. The symbol they chose, the Black Panther, reflected the radicalism and belief in racial separatism that increasingly characterized SNCC during the last half of the 1960s. The SNCC began to grow, at least members of it began to grow far more militant. They became more radicalized in their thinking, as it says here that they believed in racial separatism. And if you listen to Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, he definitely would not have adhered to that type of thinking, right? And ultimately what happens is these disillusioned members begin to form new organizations, including the Black Panther, okay? And it says the Black Panther symbol was later adopted by the California-based Black Panther Party, formed in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And some will argue, I'm not sure I agree with it, but I've heard some historians argue that the Black Panther movement is not part of the civil rights movement. that it was something different. But the truth of the matter is that it was born out of the civil rights movement, because the SNCC was part of the civil rights movement. It's just that as time went on, many SNCC members and others, including Black Islam, began to distance themselves and disagree with King's militant nonviolence philosophy. Okay? Alright, let's move on. This is that seal, by the way. I just wanted to, since I mentioned it, I thought I'd throw it up there so you could get to take a look at it. I don't have anything to say about it. Black Panther Party, Panther Power. There you have it. Gonna move on. Okay, it says here that by the late 1960s, organizations such as the NAACP, the SCLC, and SNCC faced increasingly strong challenges from new militant organizations such as the Black Panther Party. The Panthers' strategy of, quote, picking up the gun reflected the sentiments of many inner-city blacks. Okay, in other words, the Black Panther Party and others just said, we're not doing this nonviolence anymore. Our slogan is pick up the gun. When we get violence, we respond with violence. It says a series of major riots, as the authorities called them, or rebellions, which the sympathizers used, erupted during the last half of the 1960s. And the civil rights movement really begins to take on a new dimension, right? One where this isn't less of a movement as it is really, it's becoming an act of rebellion. Because, you know, like I mentioned before, and again, I think Malcolm X says it well, and I think you'll hear this on the next slide, you know, if King's philosophy was really solving the problems that the black community had, then Malcolm X and others probably would have gotten behind him, but they didn't see it as solving the major problems, right? Yeah, you end, you know, the rash that's on your arm, but did you address the thing that caused the rash, right? You addressed segregation, but did you address the thing that caused segregation? And I think that's where many members of the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I would assume that they would agree with that. Okay? Moving on. It says, often influenced by the black nationalism of Elisha Muhammad and Malcolm X, and by Pan-African leaders, proponents of black liberation saw civil rights reforms as insufficient because they did not address the problems faced by millions of poor blacks, and because African American citizenship was derived ultimately from the involuntary circumstances of enslavement. It says, in addition, proponents of racial liberation often saw the African American freedom struggle in international terms as a movement for human rights and national self-determination for all people. Now, one of the things I want you to do is click on Malcolm X's name, and you're going to hear him speak, and he's going to talk a little bit about his beliefs and what he thinks about Martin Luther King Jr. And then also here on the bottom it says film. That's an optional film, but it will talk about the development of the Black Panthers and the early movement of the Black Panther Party. So if that's something you're interested in and want to know more about, I've placed it there as a resource for you. Okay? Okay, let's move on. All right, a couple of important pieces of legislation that do get passed during the civil rights movement, and in many respects these are landmark decisions, but they are decisions which should never have had to been made because they say very similar things as the Constitution said. But let's mention them real quick. One of the landmark legislation that gets passed is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It says this ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This is considered one of the crowning legislative achievements of the civil rights movement. It was first proposed by President John F. Kennedy. It survived strong opposition from Southern members of Congress, not surprising, and was then signed into law by Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson. In subsequent years, Congress expanded the act and also passed additional legislation aimed at bringing equality to African Americans, and this would include the Voting Rights Act of 1965, okay, which is the other piece of landmark legislation. So let's take a look at that next. So, in addition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which again ended segregation and pushed forward fair employment practices, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, this was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson on August 6, 1965. aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote under the 15th Amendment. Okay? It says the act significantly widened the franchise and is considered among the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in U.S. history. Okay? So that's the civil rights movement, like sort of in a nutshell, and I hurried through that. There's so much more that we can say, but I have one last slide I do want to look at to sort of assess what happens and how this develops after the civil rights movement supposedly tapers out. So let's move on to the final slide. It says that despite the civil rights gains of the 1960s, racial discrimination and repression remained a significant factor in American life. And of course, even to this day, we can see that that's the case. It says, even after President Johnson declared a war on poverty and King initiated a Poor People's Campaign in 1968, and in fact, Martin Luther King Jr. will be assassinated in 1968. It says, despite these movements, the distribution of the nation's wealth and income moved toward greater inequality during the 70s and 80s. Civil rights advocates acknowledged that desegregation had not brought significant improvements in the lives of poor blacks, but they were divided over the future direction of black advancement efforts. To a large degree, moreover, many of the civil rights efforts of the 70s and 80s were devoted to defending previous gains or strengthening enforcement rather than achieving new ones. And so after 1970 or so, the civil rights movement sort of tapers off. And I think today we're still trying to address and deal with these issues. We've definitely progressed and moved forward in a lot of ways, but perhaps not as far as we would have liked. Okay. Now again, I mentioned, that was a quick overview of the civil rights movement. There's so much more that we could talk about and should probably talk about, but for the sake of time, we're not going to. The last thing I'd like for you to take a look at here is there's a film, Civil Rights and African Americans. Just click on that, and it's going to talk briefly about a woman named Betty Friedan and the second wave feminism. I sort of toss this in here. I want to talk a lot more about women's rights, but again, we've talked quite a bit today. So just watch this film, and it's going to give you a general sense of what second wave feminism was. And in many ways, the civil rights movement for African Americans helped to further the second wave feminism and women's rights movements of this time, as well as others, including Latino rights and gay rights as well. So at any rate, before I digress any further, go ahead and click on that, and that will end our lecture for today. So go in peace, be warm and filled, and as always, may the force be with you.